Thanks for the invitation. It's great to come home. Although one thing that you'll notice on my background that was not mentioned is that I'm not a specialist in the World Bank or the IMF, although my general area of interest is resource and environmental economists. So my comments are going to be very brief and echo some of the things that have been said here and talk about in general. But I think that one of the themes, if the idea was to construct panels to have contradictory views to stimulate discussion and see some sparks fly, I don't think you're going to find that on this panel. In fact, probably all of us could sign an agreement here that says that the title should have been Environment and Development exclamation point instead of question mark. Getting into this area and thinking about what to say here also was a very fortuitous timing for me, because it actually turns out that next week that I'm heading down to Washington in order to talk about a potential leave from Yale to take a position in the Department of Treasury, working for many of the programs that I was just hearing about. So this is perfect for me. So I actually want to finish up here so I can hear more about some of the particular programs that are going on at the World Bank. But being new to the area, what I did is I actually was looking at the Treasury budget to look at some of the allocations that the U.S. actually contributes to some of these funds. And I was sort of approached this as a question of, well, why? Just the most basic question, why does the United States contribute money to the World Bank from various these programs? Now, of course, you can go to the webpage and you can look at the mission of the World Bank, and it says in a very nice, very simple way, our work is challenging, but our mission is simple: help reduce poverty. And why is that? Well, that's because the world over time has had an increasing sense of globalization and global markets. So one sense is you could have there's a benevolent aspect to that, but the other thing is that all these things are very connected. And because of that connection, it's in everyone's strategic interest in order to alleviate poverty. And in one sense, here's a specific quote from Timothy Geithner's letter trying to get approval for the budget. He says, "Investments in multilateral institutions remain a cost-effective way to promote our national security, support future economic growth, and address key global challenges." So you can see there's a mix here of both strategic interests and benevolent interests. And as I think about that, I think about it in the context of environmental concerns. And for quite a while, it's been recognized that environmental problems transcend political boundaries in the same way that what happens in one economy actually has spillover effects beyond borders as well. But one of the things that's happened over the last several decades is the scale of many of the environmental problems that we face, and as we saw some evidence in the previous presentations and discussions, have truly become global. These are biodiversity loss, resource scarcity, water, and in particular, the overarching problem of climate change. And being sort of an economist skeptic, not a skeptic of climate change, but not trying to take anything for granted. And I'm not a climate scientist, although in my office I interact with climate scientists all around. I'm kind of thinking back to the 35, 40 years ago, the whole limits to growth movement. And is climate change just another one of these environmental concerns that we could have a sort of a token session in a panel about development, and then we keep going on and doing our business, and we'll have the same maybe token session in the future. And I think that the problem of climate change really changes the game in a very important way. And in a fundamental way, when I think back to limits to growth and whether or not we're running out of resources to satisfy human needs, I think about the problem back then was, well, we don't really know this extent of how much of the resources that we have. And actually the thing that we could measure pretty well is what people are doing with these resources. So the speculation was about how much there was of the resource. Climate change, in a sense, is really amazing. We have no idea what people are doing all the time, but the thing is we have this thermometer, which is not temperature necessary. The scientists map this into temperature, but just the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it's like a sufficient statistic for trouble that is coming in a really physical way. And this problem is not going away. And in fact, over the last 2 decades of climate science, all the predictions are coming true. And if anything, we saw the slide of the receding ice. It's worse than the scientific studies actually say. So this problem is not going to go away. And in fact, the scale of these problems have led to a term which maybe some of you have referred to as, we've entered a new geological era called the Anthropocene, emphasizing that humans are actually now affecting the planet and the globe in a geological way. So this is kind of a roundabout way of coming to the idea, underscoring the point that it needs to be an environment and development exclamation point and not question mark, because it's in everyone's strategic interest to combine development and environment, because we all share this global environment, which is actually starting to experience some of these consequences. So it was mentioned before, there's also the, when I think of environment and development, and when I teach my environmental economics class and we go through sustainable development, we talk about the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, put together by the United Nations in 1987. And there's a famous definition in that report that says, what is sustainable development? Well, I guess you got to always have these things be, not only one sentence, but one sentence without punctuation. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. That has been quoted and cited so many times and has been so influential. And I would submit that part of the reason is it's an example of what Professor Robinson mentioned last night of saying less and less about more and more. It really captures kind of everything. We don't really know exactly what the needs are that we're talking about, and we also don't know exactly when we are compromising them. And so when Professor Robinson, he was sort of referring to, this is Bob Solo's, you can either say less and less about more or say more and more about less. I figured I'd throw in another Bob Solo quotation about sustainable development back in 1992 when he was speaking to Resources for the Future. His take on it is, as things stand, if I express a commitment to sustainability, all that tells you is that I'm unhappy with the modern consumerist lifestyle. If I poo-poo the whole thing, on the other hand, all you conclude is that I'm for business as usual. It's not a very satisfactory state of affairs. So in response to that, in some respects, I think those same words could actually apply today in terms of what sustainability actually really means as a general concept. But there's an entire academic literature that sort of focuses on that. And one of the key ideas that comes up is this ability to substitute between human-made capital and natural capital. So as we diminish our natural resources or our natural capital, do we have sufficient investments in our human-made technologies or our human capital in order to innovate our ways out of these problems? And oftentimes people partition the world up into sort of the so-called weak sustainability camp, which says that you can't substitute between these things very well, and or that you can substitute very well between them, and the strong sustainability, which says that you can't, and you really ought to kind of really protect this natural capital. And I'm not sure these are philosophical questions as much as they are kind of empirical questions. It sort of depends what natural capital we are talking about. And there's been quite a bit of movement towards measuring this, and much of this has come from indicators that have come out of research at the World Bank. And I also, for those students or others who are interested, there is a wonderful new report that just came out this year, headed by Partha Dasgupta, called the Inclusive Wealth Report 2012, Measuring Progress Towards Sustainability, that tries to integrate some of these ideas. So now I just want to kind of emphasize my point and then just give a couple of vital statistics that kind of keep me up at night and that sort of focus what I think of as some of my very modest recommendations for the future of these international institutions for helping to solve some of these environmental problems. And that's that it's not a question of benevolence, it's a question of self-interest for countries that actually contribute to these funds and trying to cause these beneficial changes and basically shift the way that we do a lot of things, and in particular when it comes to energy and climate change. So just a couple of statistics that I was looking up here. These are the kinds of things that sort of lay out the challenge that we have ahead of us. So for example, 10 years ago, we generate most of our electricity with coal here in the United States. Increasingly natural gas the last couple of years with hydrologic fracking that's happened. But China, 10 years ago, had the coal-fired capacity of 50% of the US. That's just 10 years ago. Now, it's 200% of the US. That is a massive change, and that change is actually predicted, a modest estimate, is going to increase by 60% over the next decade. So what I'll submit to you is all these international environmental agreements about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the European Union and from the United States, that one statistic alone easily swamps any potential reductions that we're talking about. And that doesn't even mention that the forecast for India is that the amount of coal-fired electricity generation capacity is forecasted to increase by 300% in the next decade, and that's bigger than the amount that actually I just mentioned for China. The worrisome part about this is not just the emissions that comes from these power plants, but once these power plants get built and are incredibly expensive to construct, it's very difficult to not use them. So one of the important things is to try to get in, create the institutional expertise and the financing to try to tip the direction of where these investments actually go, because they tend to have quite a long lifetime, 40, 50 years for power plants at least. So if you forecast that out into the future, it just exacerbates the problem. A couple other things, transportation. In 1990, China had 5.5 million cars. That's 5.5 million. Today they have 7.5 million. In the next 8 years, they're forecasted to have 200 million. In the US, we currently have 250 million. That's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the tailpipe of vehicles. There, the need is to help find ways to fund projects that show that they work, to have change the infrastructure so that that path does not happen. Because if that path happens, there's dramatic consequences for the planet. The other one that was just mentioned in Ken's presentation is the amount of urbanization that's happening. The way that people live on this planet has massively changed in the past 20 years. The next 20 years, it's going to be more. In 1960, 1/3 of the world's population lived in an urban environment. In 2017, it's predicted that it's going to be 50-50 between the urban and rural environments. And all the future growth that is forecast is going to be in the urban environment. Planning, infrastructure, transportation to change the way we do stuff is just going to be totally essential. Stepping back now and continuing with just the climate change and energy theme, I would say you notice that in the past 10 years, there's been a lot of talk, both in terms of academics, policymakers, and I think also within institutions like the World Bank, where it used to be all about mitigation, which is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and now everybody's talking about adaptation. And I think, there's reason for that in the sense that mitigation is providing a global public good. It's costly for any individual or any nation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for these diffuse benefits for the planet as a whole. Solving a collective action problem that was mentioned earlier today, that is a really difficult challenge, particularly on a global scale. I once messed around with it writing sort of a paper called Climate Change. It's not the perfect storm, but the perfect problem. It has all these elements, and it is the ultimate global collective action problem. But interestingly, climate change adaptation is not a collective action problem. For any nation, any investment, that is actually a private good. We could actually see that stuff happening. You have incentives to adjust your behavior, to protect yourself. Your municipalities, your nations have an incentive to do investments in protecting itself from the increasing variability of the global climate system. And then my last two remarks here are basically how you actually think about this. And again, this is because I'm not a specialist on the particular programs at these organizations, but to me, there's two areas that are in need, and I'll leave it up to my panelists in the Q&A to figure out how to do it. One, maybe counterintuitively, I don't know, is actually the creation of more markets, more financial markets. For example, I was reading some stuff by a colleague of mine, Bob Schiller, and he talks about how the earthquake that just occurred in Haiti was in 2010 was caused incredible damage and was really tragic in many ways. But one of the reasons why it was so tragic is precisely because there were not well-developed insurance markets. So when that stuff gets wiped out, it's gone. That's a complete loss for all the citizenry. So the creation of insurance markets actually helps buffer the costs in terms of damages. But the other thing that it does is it creates decentralized incentives to go out and make sure that there's building codes and standards are actually applied to help people protect themselves. The other thing is I would submit that everybody likes to do things, but when it also comes to climate change adaptation and projects, I think it's sometimes important to recognize that the important thing you could do is what you don't do instead of what you do. 2 years ago, I was asked to go down and work with the government of El Salvador to try to work on some of their climate change adaptation plans. And the thing that I just could not believe is if you looked at where all the economic growth is happening and all the activity, and if you take a GIS map and you lay out where all that is happening, and then you put a GIS map over that of what are all the areas that are susceptible to landslide, flooding, and vulnerability, it's all the same spots. So in terms of protecting yourself from future damages from climate change or environmental risks, sometimes it's just important to just not do certain things instead of actually promoting to do more things. And with that, I'm done. Thanks.